Hello, and welcome to Cherry Bekart's GovCon podcast, where we discuss current government contracting trends, compliance matters, and best practices to guide federal contractors forward. My name is Neal Beggan. I'm a partner and the DC market leader with Cherry Bekaert. And joining me today are Steve Ursillo and Brian Kirk, leaders in Cherry Bekart's cybersecurity group, heavily focused on meeting the needs of our government contracting clients. Today, we're going to continue to talk about CMMC, which had a recent update earlier this month. But before we get to that, let me first thank Steve and Brian for joining me, and let's take a step back. Steve, I'm going to start with you. I'm assuming if people haven't been living under a rock, they know what CMMC is, but for purposes of this podcast, just really quick, what is it and why does it matter?
Thanks, Neal, and welcome everybody. Yeah, so CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, has been gaining some traction over the past few years, and obviously has continued to evolve and is on the radar for many folks within the defense industrial base. So basically, the CMMC certification originated from really the need for the evolution and maturity of validation on the DFARS 7012 requirements for protecting controlled and classified information. So basically, it was developed by the Department of Defense, really to ensure that contractors and subcontractors within the defense industrial base are properly controlling and securing controlled and classified information. So DFARS has been around, 7012 has been around for quite some time. I think it was around 2017, and it has kind of taken a bit of a form over time that's requiring folks to self-assess against the NIST 800-171 requirements. And then over time, again, formalizing those self-assessments into spurs so that they could get adequate scores that provided enough transparency on where they were in meeting those requirements. What you're finding with CMMC is that the DoD basically recognized that there's a need for consistency and further validation from folks that are applying a consistent standard against the NIST 800-171 criteria. And in doing so, they're expecting organizations, through a timeline that I know we'll be discussing here further, to adhere to these different levels of certification. Ultimately, because of the fact that the threat landscape is evolving, and any threat to controlled and classified information would obviously have a material effect on, our national defense. It would have an impact on any technological advantage that we could have, any of our military capabilities, so on and so forth. There's that increased need for making sure that we defend that within the supply chain. So this expectation is really looking to cascade down from primes all the way to subs, and obviously is going to be something that's needed in order to ensure that level of security to mitigate the latest threats. It's applicable, like I said, to prime and subcontractors, but also to the cloud service providers that they use, any managed service providers they use, so on and so forth. So it really is something that we're expecting much more traction on. The framework itself is really based on 3 levels. Level 1 is really protecting basic safeguarding of federal contract information. It's typically done in a self-assessment. Level 2 is really, like we said, protection of controlled and classified information, aka CUI. That's requiring the NIST 800-171 full requirements there, and that's going to be really bifurcated into either a self-assessment or a third-party certification, with the self-assessment being the exception, not the norm. We expect to see very little, if any, of those self-assessments. Now, granted, they get a certification and it's once every 3 years. They will be self-assessing. The organizations that are seeking compliance will be self-assessing every year as part of that, but they'll get the certification every 3 years. The level 3 is really a more advanced level that's includes everything within 2 and 1 because they're all cumulative, but it's really protection against advanced persistent threats. And this is going to be something that's going to be handled by the DoD directly as part of what they would expect for an enhanced assessment.
That's excellent, Steve. Appreciate it. A lot of great information in there. So we covered, what CMMC is, talked a little bit about the framework, why it was created, why it's important, and obviously who needs CMMC. At the beginning of the call, I alluded to some big news that came out earlier this month regarding the 48 CFR rule. So I'm going to go to Brian here in a second to unpack that a little bit. And I'll just warn the audience, a lot of numbers, a lot of letters here to get through. But Brian, if you could talk a little bit about this finalization of the 48 CFR rule that we learned about earlier this month, please.
Yeah, thanks, Neal, and great to be with you. So as we alluded to, so the 48 CFR is essentially known as the acquisition rule. What that does is it gives the contracting officers authority to enforce CMC requirements and solicitations and contracts. The 48 CFR integrates CMC into the DFARS, specifically through clause 252.204-7021. It also works in conjunction with another rule that went into effect last year. So 32 CFR Part 170, which I'm sure all the listeners on this call are familiar with by now, that was published to the Federal Register in October of last year and went into effect in December of last year as well. So 48 is essentially the acquisition rule that complements the CFR 32 rule that stands up the CMC program and allows contracting officers to enforce CMC requirements through the contracts and solicitations. What CFR 48, what 32 CFR Part 170 does is it introduces or defines an implementation phase that contracting officers will follow as they designate CMC levels into contracts. So those, as Steve had mentioned in the previous section there, when he was going through different CMC levels, so level 1, level 2, and level 3, within the contracts themselves, the contracting officer will specify the CMC level that will be required in order to be awarded that contract. Those levels are essentially based off attributes of the information that will be processed, stored, and transmitted on covered contractor information systems. There was a DoD memo or memorandum that was issued in January of this year, and it provided additional clarification around the CMC levels, the phase implementation process, as well as the waiver process. But it includes some important information there that will help organizations to be able to identify what level they might be expecting coming down the pike. So, for example, in the DoD memorandum, it states that the CMC or the minimum assessment requirement when the planned contract will require the contractor to process, store, transmit COI, categorized under the National Archives COI Registry Defense Organizational Indexing Group. So what that means is if you go to the NARA COI archives, there's a specific category for defense, and there are certain COI types that are included in that category. Per the memo, the minimum assessment requirement would be a third-party assessment if you're storing, processing, and transmitting any of the COI types that are within that defense category. So that would include controlled technical information, DoD critical infrastructure security information, naval and nuclear propulsion information, privileged safety information, and unclassified controlled nuclear information defense. Controlled technical information is the more common one, and most of and as Steve had mentioned in the previous section, the level 2 is bifurcated into self-assessments and certification assessments, and that the self-assessments are expected to be few and far between. A good reason for that is because a lot of the COI information that is involved in the contracts that DoD is issuing is controlled technical information, which would, per the DoD memorandum, force you into a third-party certification assessment for CMMC. Now, what does the timeline look like? So back in July of 2020, or on July 22nd, the DoD submitted the final rule to OIRA for review. As Neal had mentioned, the big news, OIRA completed its review and cleared 48 CFR on August 25th of 2025, so just a few weeks ago. Currently, the rule is being prepared for publication to the Federal Register. What the unknown is what will the effective date be for 48 CFR? As if we go back in time to 32 CFR, that rule had a 60-day effective or waiting period until it became effective. So it was published to the Federal Register on October 15th, and it went into effect on December 15th. For the 48 CFR rule, it's expected that it'll go into effect pretty quickly. I mean, it could really be anywhere between 1 to 60 days for when that rule goes into effect after being published to the Federal Register. So currently, everybody's in a wait and see mode right now until that rule gets published to the Federal Register and we start to understand what that effect, or we know what that effective date would be. So the phase rollout. So once C48 CFR goes into effect, that will essentially start the phase rollout process where contracting officers can insert into contracts and solicitation CMC requirements by CMC level 1, level 2, or level 3. So there's 4 phases in the rollout process that will span 4 years as a DoD rolls out these requirements into contracts. So when 48 CFR goes into effect, that'll start phase 1 of the phase rollout. Phase 1 would be the level 1 and level 2 self-assessments. So the contracting officers in phase 1 will input, CMC level 1 or CMC level 2 self, which will indicate that that contractor needs to have a self-assessment against that applicable requirement. Now, it's important to note that the DoD has discretion in phase 1 to include level 2 third-party assessments in contracts. It can be at their discretion. However, in phase 1, we expect the most of those requirements to roll out to be the level 1 and level 2 self-assessments. And then we move, and 1 year from that, or 1 year from 48 CFR going into effect, begins the phase 2 rollout period. So phase 2 is when level 2 third-party assessments become mandatory. So as contracts come up for renew periods or new contracts get issued, contractors will need to have a third-party level 2 assessment in order to be awarded that contract. And then we go 1 year out from that. So then we're 2 years out from CFR 48 going into effect. That's when the DoD will start to roll out the level 3 assessment requirements. And level 3, as Steve had mentioned, that's a government-led assessment, but it's important to note that in order to get a level 3 assessment from the government, you first have to have a level 2 certification assessment from a C3PAO. And then you take that certificate to the government and get your level 3 assessment by the government. And then 1 year after that, we're in phase 4, and phase 4 is essentially the full implementation across all applicable DoD contracts. So what are the implications for contractors? The big one, contractors must have the appropriate CMC level in place before contract award. Next, prime contractors are responsible for ensuring their supply chain is compliant. So for subcontractors, this is a big impact, and it may make the phase rollout process by the DoD moot, in that the prime contractors have a responsibility for making sure that their supply chain is secure and is compliant with the CMC requirements. So likely, and what we've already seen in the marketplace to date, is that those prime contractors are starting to require their subcontractors to obtain a CMC level 2 certification assessment, for example, by a specific date, so that they can make sure that their supply chain is compliant when they eventually receive those requirements. So that kind of wraps up there, kind of going through, the CFR 48.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Brian. A lot of good stuff. And I mean, you touched on something that Steve had alluded to earlier, and that this is a flow down clause, huge impacts into the subcontractors, but also some responsibility there at the prime level to make sure that folks are in compliance. It's obviously going to make a decision when primes are looking who to engage or not to engage with on pursuits where some of these requirements may be existing. And then, appreciate the overview. You talked about the timeline. You talked about the phased rollout. I will just go ahead and provide the answer that I'm sure you would give. That's not an excuse for somebody to wait 4 years to start down the CMMC path. Certainly with the challenges that we've seen over the last couple of years, some persisted, some are new based on CMMC 2.0. So I want to touch on some of those. I'm going to go back to Steve and then let him pick a couple, and then Brian after that. We talk about some of these challenges around scoping, some of the things you mentioned about identification of CUI or CUI that Steve mentioned earlier, use of third parties and the like. So I'm just going to ask each of you to just give me a couple, if you would, in terms of some of these challenges, the pain points that organizations, either that we've worked with or that we know being out in market, have had in terms of their readiness to prepare for this, as well as folks that have undergone certification efforts. So Steve, I'm going to start with you if I could.
No problem. Yeah. So like any other certification or regulatory requirement that gets pushed forth, the path to success varies depending on the organization's maturity, right? Some of them have a bit more maturity in their cybersecurity and security and infosec processes. So it could be potentially an easier lift. Now, that said, these requirements, the NIST 800-171 requirements are not new, right? These have been in effect now since somewhere around 2017. So, a lot of folks have been performing their self-assessments against this. However, I think in many cases, as part of the reason why the program is where it is, there's been some inconsistency there. And I think certain organizations have looked at this and self-assessed in a favorable fashion. But when you start to really unpack the CMMC requirements and you look at the scoping guide and you look at the assessment methodology, you quickly learn that there are some very nuanced elements of CMMC that require a deeper dive that can really be something that if you don't understand or fully map out could lead to potential challenges that we'll speak to here. Holistically, we're seeing organizations that have scored much more favorable on their self-assessments once they go through their CMMC readiness have to go back and revisit those scores related to how they applied NIST with CMMC requirements. And those scores have been materially different from their original settings there. Now, that's not everybody, right? There's exceptions, but for the most part, we are seeing that. In addition, if you solicit from many C3PAOs, as everybody knows, we provide readiness as well as certification as a C3PAO. Obviously, can't do it to the same client for independence reasons, but we do sit on both sides of that fence, depending on the relationship. And what we found in our experience and with discussions with others is that some organizations that bring folks to the table to do the certification find that many of them, I'll say less than half, but still a good fair number, are not making it out of phase one, meaning they think they're ready, but then when the assessor gets in, they start to look at all of the required documentation. There's clear showstoppers there that make them have to go back and kind of revisit and put pen to paper. So I think that's probably a larger element of consideration. And I think that folks have kind of put this on the back burner, hoping that, it would get kicked down the curb. But ultimately, it's here to stay. It's evolving fast and people need to step in. So in light of some of the more technical elements of what we've seen, folks who have hybrid environments, so many organizations will try to isolate their CUI boundaries by having what we call an enclave or a segregated environment to try to minimize the scope and the flow of CUI so that the certification can be a bit more streamlined. But that becomes a little bit of a challenge for those, like, for example, in manufacturing plants and other environments where you have to have this hybrid environment. You have to have these systems, these manufacturing systems and other specialized equipment that's handling and processing the controlled and classified information in order to conduct and facilitate the contractual requirements. So, dealing with the boundaries and dealing with the flow of CUI in hybrid environments and the scoping has been one challenge that we've seen for some organizations. Certainly something that can be navigated, but certainly something that needs to be looked at closely. The other thing, too, is the required asset classification with CMMC. So whether or not an asset is a CUI asset, whether it's a security protection asset, a contract risk managed asset, specialized asset, or if the asset's out of scope, they all have very prescriptive rules as it pertains to what constitute those assets. And there are requirements that follow those assets that cascade down to the network and other elements of the environment based on those classifications. So it's really important to have those classifications correct and then understanding the impact to the surrounding environment, including third parties. The other thing that we've seen is folks that are struggling between the logical segregation between their CUI environment and their non-CUI environment. So in other words, having certain assets that are accessing the CUI environment in environments that are not in the CUI environment and trying to deal with how they keep that segregated, right? There are some, once again, nuanced challenges in the rules that clearly describe what logical segregation means. And it's sometimes, some of the solutioning that we're seeing is not fully sufficient as it pertains to what's required for some of those logical and or physical segregations. We've seen folks navigate certain types of boundary challenges by using VDIs, where they're actually trying to use virtual workspaces or workstations inside isolated environments in order to properly handle that flow. But again, depending on some of the nuances there, there could be some challenges as to what gets brought into scope. But we do see that happening. In addition, we're seeing endpoints that are accessing, say, like cloud enclaves, people thinking that those are out of scope, but in fact, because they're being used to store, process, and transmit, and they don't necessarily have that logical segregation, those are being brought into scope, which cascades down to the environment and obviously the needed logical segregation that's needed in order to keep it out of scope, right? So those are the things that we see there. Two other real important elements of consideration that continue to have deep discussions is really around the external service providers, or ESPs. ESPs could be somebody like a managed service provider that's actually helping the organization seeking compliance manage their cybersecurity. The question is, do they store, process, or handle CUI, or are they handling just security protection data? In many cases, there's a requirement there, obviously, that those external service providers need to be able to participate, and in certain cases may even need their own certification, but at least at a minimum, participate in the actual CMMC assessment for the organization seeking compliance. They need to have all the required documentation, shared responsibility, expectations, so on and so forth. And then you have the cloud service providers. There's an expectation and a clear NIST definition on those providers. And if you're using a cloud service provider to store, process, or transmit CUI, they do require a FedRAMP certification or the equivalent of a FedRAMP moderate, assessment in order to make sure that they are viable. So there's a couple. There's some related to identification and labeling of CUI and the SSPs or the system security plans. Brian, if you want to comment on those, I think that'd probably be good.
So CMC has certain requirements that require robust documentation to be put in place. One of those is the system security plan. The system security plan is the backbone of any CMC certification assessment that a contractor would go through. What we've kind of seen in the marketplace is certain, and again, not the rule, but certainly the exception. Some system security plans often lack detail and fail to address the 320 assessment objectives that are defined within NIST 171A and the CMC Level 2 assessment guide. So, for example, a lot of contractors in the early days of DFARS 7012, were required to implement NIST 171, and they kind of just stopped there as far as developing their system security plans. They were just addressing the 110 requirements from 171 and not looking at the assessment objectives from 171A and making sure that the implementation details were described within their system security plan for how they're addressing each one of the assessment objectives. Furthermore, with any assessment objectives, there's specific terminology that's important to pay attention to. Some of those key terms are defined, specified, identified. They have a really explicit meaning in that when you see the term defined or specified, it means that something needs to be documented somewhere, or a list or a database or inventory maintained somewhere. The most common one, for example, are identifying users, authorized users with access to the system. A lot of contractors will just refer to Active Directory. Active Directory is great if that's your main source for identification access management, as far as making sure that authorized users are limited or access is limited to those authorized users. But per the assessment objective A and 3.1.1, the contractor is required to identify those authorized users, which should be a listing that's maintained outside of the access management system, so that the assessor can look at, okay, let me see the users you've identified that are authorized to access the system, and then as part of a test I'll perform to assess when the assessment objectives are require you to limit access to authorized users. Let me look at Active Directory and verify that you've limited access to those users that you've identified. So that's one of the key common pitfalls, I would say, around the system security plan, and it's just not paying attention to certain details or key terminology and not addressing the assessment objectives. Additionally, some data flow diagrams lack a little bit or in network boundary diagrams lack the sufficient details for an assessor to be able to really get comfort and understanding of the boundaries that they're looking at and how CUI data flows within those boundaries. The next one here that's very common, and I think if you're a contractor in the space at this point in time, you haven't had this challenge yet, then you're probably not living. But so CUI identification and labeling. A lot of contractors, when they'll come to us for readiness, it's probably the most common question we receive is, we don't know what is CUI as part of this contract, or what is CUI in this environment. So there's some ways you can go about, trying to identify CUI that's in your environment. Ultimately, though, at the end of the day, it's important to know that it's the DoD's job to identify CUI. So CUI information is only CUI if the DoD says it's CUI. So if you get data that you, as a contractor, and you suspect it might be CUI, but it's not labeled, you still need to go to the DoD or to the contracting officer and ask if that information is CUI. Once you know information has been designated as CUI, then you, as a contractor, have responsibility to mark that information as CUI with the applicable CUI markings that are defined within the CUI registry. Contractors encountering CUI that is unmarked have the responsibility to go to the contracting officer and determine if the information is CUI. It's recommended it's recommended against self-marking. So don't go ahead and make the assumption that this is CUI and assume what category of CUI that information is and apply the labels. Instead, go back to the DoD or to the contracting officer and confirm if that information is actually CUI. If a contractor expects the information to be CUI, then you can't, as a contractor, you can't send that information to anyone that is not an authorized holder or authorized to receive the CUI data. Instead, recommend the contractor go to the government, to the contracting officer, with a note asking if the information is CUI, and stating that we're going to assume it's not CUI if we haven't heard back from you within X amount of business days, 7, 10 business days. And then at least at that point, you have the implicit approval that the information is not CUI. Another avenue, and maybe just kind of throw some caution to the wind before going to this avenue first, is that the CUI program office is able to take issues over classifying of CUI. Now, again, though, consider the relationship with the prime and DoD personnel you're working with before you go down that road. I will leave that as a last resort. On the flip side, if you receive information marked CUI that shouldn't be, as a contractor, you can push back on that. Ask if they meant to mark the information as CUI. Additionally, contractors are supposed to receive what's called a security classification guide, or SCG, that lays out what attributes about the information made it CUI in the first place. In most cases, when a contractor asks for the SCG, the agency will come back and say, that there was a mistake, that the information, should not have been classified as CUI. Further, CUI labeling requirements would apply to limited dissemination controls. Pay attention to if any information you're receiving has limited dissemination controls, because that can also restrict who you're able to send CUI data to, or where you're able to send the CUI data to. And this, in addition, has additional marking requirements for information as well. So those are additional challenges that we've seen so far in the space that contractors are facing.
That's a lot. I'm sure there's a couple more. We talked about some of the big ones here, scoping issues, certainly the importance of getting your SSP right, which obviously has a lot to do with making sure that things were scoped correctly. CUI or QE identification and labeling has always been a huge component, and some of the other challenges that we're hearing about. And Steve, I'm going to come to you and maybe unpack a couple of these. And I don't want this to all be challenges, right? So let's talk a little bit. Let's talk about operational challenges, but maybe some of the GRC tools that folks are finding useful, and what makes sense to do in and around those GRC tools, as well as just kind of as people are preparing for these assessments. Let's talk about some of the tips, and we've talked about some of the challenges, and so kind of the counterpoint to some of those, if you will, Steve.
Sounds good. So I'll kind of touch upon each of those because I think it's important. But yeah, obviously we're talking about some operational challenges, but we certainly want to gravitate towards some of the things that we've seen that help overcome some of those challenges as well. I think it's important from the standpoint of any assessment is really going to start with a sound readiness process, right? So it's really important to get a good understanding of where you are in your journey for CMMC, whether or not your self-assessment that you've done has been complete, has followed the lines of the law related to what's required for CMMC, meaning making sure that the proposed scoping boundaries aligned with the scoping guides. You've followed what you need to for the appropriate network diagrams. You have your proper asset inventories, including all elements of that. Brian brought up the point that it's really important that as you're looking for the detailed prescriptive requirements, you look at everything that they're expecting within that documentation in a formal fashion. Make sure the classifications are accurate with those assets as spoken earlier. And then, of course, making sure that you know the flow of CUI in and out of your environment so that you can show that to the assessor so they get a good understanding during that initial phase to understand the boundaries of what's happening. So those are really important to frame up. Having a complete SSP and addressing all of these objectives is really important. And I would strongly encourage mapping each of those requirements to the SSP so that you know if there's anything that's gating or missing. It could take just one of those sub requirements to not be met to make the entire requirement not met, right? So you don't want to get caught up on some type of technicality. So the attention to detail and making sure that you're following suit on all of those requirements becomes really, really important. We talked about the asset inventory, can't emphasize that enough. In many cases, folks that we're doing readiness for will actually do a mock assessment. And what that allows for, it gives the organization an opportunity to see what the assessment would be like. It helps them understand the types of questions, the types of evidential matter that would come forth, what the assessor may be thinking as it pertains to how they're approaching something. So we do have many clients that take advantage after doing the readiness to do a mock assessment or go through a mock assessment before they do a certification. There are definitely benefits and values there. The other thing, too, that we have clients where we're actually providing readiness services where we get integrated in as part of a compliance program. So we help them initially do that through different types of workflow formalities, including the use of GRC tools, which I'll get to in a minute, that would allow for kind of the day-to-day workflow management of managing these controls, the requirements, and then obviously making sure that the program is sustainable over year one and going into years 2, 3, so on and so forth. It makes it an easier lift. Like anything else, you don't want to do an audit, then don't touch anything for a few years, rely on self-assessments that might be accurate, not accounting for changes, and then next thing you know, 3 years later, you're starting from scratch again. So it's really important, to have kind of this integrated discipline and maturity through this process. This is not going away. It's going to continue to mature. It evolves with the advances in technology and the threat landscape. So it's really important to stay on top of that. When you think about GRC tools, that's not a requirement, but we do have some organizations that have recognized being able to put in certain types of governance, risk, and compliance tools in order to track progress on controls, documentation, and integration. The one thing that I would say is that you have to just be careful that there's not an over-reliance on these GRC tools. So GRC tools can definitely operationalize efficiencies. They can streamline communication, document management, stuff like that, build out workflows for tasks and pulling, certain types of artifacts and objects out of your tech stack. But it's really important to know that this is not hey, give the auditor access to the GRC tool. They'll click a few buttons and your audit will be done in a fraction of the time. That is not the case. So, there are efficiencies that will cascade, but ultimately, the auditor does have to make sure that they are comfortable with the evidential matter at the raw source of the evidential matter and make sure that, any information provided by the entity is validated against origination and it's accurate, complete, and suitable for the need. So those are some of the things that, we've seen there. Brian, it's probably important for us to think a little bit about, the ecosystem, give folks an idea of what things look like as it pertains to the ecosystem and what's happening with some of the delays in getting either readiness or certification. Maybe that's our next step.
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. We're certainly seeing some bottlenecks in the ecosystem as far as getting contractors through certification assessments with C3FAOs. And a lot of that is due to really the early nature of CMMC. It's the acquisition rule is going to go into effect here in any time within the next, let's say 60 days, maybe give or take a few weeks. And then, that will start kind of the clock around the DoD rolling out requirements in the contract. So we're still from a CMC contractual phase, still kind of in the early process there. However, as far as the ecosystem, there are certainly bottlenecks, and that's due to the amount of C3POs that are currently authorized to conduct assessments. as well as certified assessors that are available to C3POs to perform those assessments. So currently there's 79 authorized C3POs. Now, depending on when you're listening to this podcast, that number may change as, thankfully there's additional C3POs that are coming on board. However, it's not I would say it's more of a trickle when the C3POs are coming on board rather than, coming through a fire hose. I think at the beginning of the year, there might have been around 60 C3POs, and now we're in September. So there still is kind of a process there in getting the C3POs on board. There is, a long kind of drawn out process for a C3PO in order to become a certifying assessor. As a C3PO, you would basically need to go through a DFARS assessment and be assessed and certified against CMMC level 2 yourself, which will require you to stand up a system security plan and do all the things that the contractors are required to do. So that creates another burden on the C3POs and getting C3POs authorized and in place to perform assessments. Additionally, just as far as like raw numbers, the DoD estimates that over 80,000 of the 300,000 contractors that are out there in the DoD space will require a level 2 third-party assessment. So, over 80,000 contractors require a level 2 third-party assessment with 79 authorized C3POs. I mean, you can do the math and pretty quickly, you can see where the bottlenecks are coming from. Yeah, so C3POs have about a 3 to 6 month waiting list, which is contributing to the bottleneck for assessment availability. But hopefully, in the future, as more C3POs come on board, more assessors get certified, we're able to reduce the amount of bottlenecks and get contractors through certification assessments more quickly. But as of right now, there is a little bit of a waiting list. So, as a contractor, it's recommended that you start to reach out and plan for your assessment as soon as you possibly can.
Yeah, so let's talk about those and kind of wrap things up here in the interest of time. And Steve, I'm going to come to you, give you 60 seconds. Brian may just have given you a nice segue there. Just talk a little bit about key takeaways and action items.
Yeah, sounds good. So I think the key takeaway here is I know this has been a long, drawn-out process, right, for the last 4 or 5 years in navigating what's happening with CMMC and obviously seeing some of the transitions and the changes and some folks just waiting to see where it lands. But we're clearly moving in a direction where it's not if, it's when, and that's happening sooner than later. So highly encourage folks, to continue their path, stay aggressive on the path that they have to make sure that they are moving as quickly and as efficiently as possible towards certification initiatives on the understanding that obviously CFR 48 hitting and having it embedded into the acquisitions, not only just the first year of self-assessments, but then subsequent certification requirements after that. We typically tell folks engage with your readiness provider sooner than later. It's really important that you have those conversations and you understand the scope, the boundaries. The overall foundation needs to be set and agreed upon so that there's no gating challenges in the 11th hour based on maybe an environment that shouldn't be used based on certification requirements, or the flow of the CUI or any of the asset file classifications are inaccurate that basically would require further trouble. So engaging in that readiness process sooner than later is great. Also, engaging with your C3PO early also has its benefits. Now, those that are providing the audit cannot provide any type of advisory advice or advisory types of services, because of the independence requirements. However, as Brian had alluded to, when you're talking about some of the capacity constraints, being on the C3PO's books and schedule sooner than later is definitely going to provide some advantage. You don't necessarily want to wait until you're ready, then try to engage and then be on a 9-month runway because of, bottlenecks in the ecosystem. So those are probably some of the more important things I would encourage people to think about. With that, I'll turn it back over. Thanks.
Excellent. And Brian, maybe some other helpful information for folks as we wrap up here. Any upcoming events, learning opportunities that folks can continue to hear more about CMMC in these updates?
Yeah, absolutely. So upcoming next month in October is the CS5 Summit, and that's hosted at the National Harbor. Cherry Bekaert will have a team there. So, if you're listening to this podcast, come up and say hi. Be happy to speak with you. Additionally, in November, we have a webinar that's scheduled to be broadcasted on November 4th. That webinar will also count as CPE. And then, further, just recommend, following updates that come out from the Cyber AB, listening to monthly town halls that they provide each month.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Brian, and appreciate you, Steve, both of you for joining today. Highly technical podcast, but just an unbelievable amount of very, very valuable information for folks. There are so many people that are still navigating the CMMC waters. We certainly encourage them to reach out to us directly. You can find more information at cbh.com. That's Charlie Bravo Hector.com. And in closing, just want to thank all of the folks for listening in. Feel free to reach out if you need anything. Otherwise, we hope you join us again for our next podcast. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.